Power creep comes with every single generation. New Pokemon, new mechanics, and new items are all part of what could be considered power creep. While most people don't like power creep, it is objectively something that brings new things, and sometimes even good things. So I'm going to be ranking the power creep from each generation, from best, as in the most positive one, to worst, as in the power creep that most negatively affected the metagame. Generation 3. Generation 3 is one of the most beloved generations of competitive Pokemon. Part of that is because of the Pokemon themselves, especially top Pokemon like Tyranitar, Blissey, and Swampert, who are balanced and favored a neatly designed metagame. Mechanically, it also brought some amazing things. In Generation 2, you could max out all of your stats. This meant that neither natures existed, and Pokemon were much bulkier. Generation 3 eliminated this mechanic by introducing natures for the first time. This was a positive mechanical change. I've never seen anyone suggest that this was negative or that we should go back to being able to max out stats. Being able to max out all of the stats made Pokemon far bulkier and harder to deal with. At first, this might not seem particularly bad, but it made Pokemon much harder to KO. This precisely is one of the reasons Gen 2 is disliked, and why people often say that every single match feels like stall, even though that's not true. It's a pretty offensively oriented game, but because of this mechanic in particular, it feels very stall-like. Generation 3 also introduced natures, which are a pivotal part of competitive Pokemon, giving more niches to Pokemon as either pure physical or special attackers. Beyond that, Generation 3 introduced abilities. Abilities are obviously a huge part of competitive Pokemon and bring a lot of complexity to the game. It's also one of those things we take for granted. As modern players, they've literally become one of the most impressive and important aspects of competitive play. They shape the entirety of the competitive landscape. Modern examples consider Gold as Gold ability or Photosynthesis, both of which dominate the current OU tier. The same principle applies to Gen 3's Tyranitar in its newly introduced Sandstream ability. Gen 3 also brought many new items like Choice Band and Lumberry. This was significant not just because it boosted offensive Pokemon, but also because it meant fewer Pokemon defaulted to leftovers, which used to be the only good item to pick. This made games shorter as not every Pokemon was constantly recovering HP. Combined with Tyranitar's Sandstream constantly chipping at both Pokemon's HP, this created a faster paced metagame. Gen 4. Gen 4 is almost as beloved as Gen 3. It was also a fairly balanced metagame, which is why most players are fond of it, aside from two particularly annoying Pokemon. Just like Gen 3, part of the success was due to the Pokemon themselves, Tyranitar, Heatran, Latias, but also brought some of the most significant mechanical changes to date, the physical special split. While Gen 3's lack of split was fun and a unique experience, most players would agree that keeping it that way would have been a mistake. And in fact, most now see the lack of split as a nostalgic gimmick-like thing, rather than a feature worth preserving. The physical special split was good for several reasons. First, it allowed dual-type Pokemon with offensive stats on opposite ends of the physical special spectrum to finally use their stab moves effectively. For example, Burloom didn't use any grass-type attacks in Gen 3 because grass was a special type and a special attack is a really pitiful 60 versus his 130 attack stat. So no one would logically invest in a special stat when a high attack stat is available right there. The split, however, in Gen 4, a lot of his move pools include Seed. Now he was able to use both of his stab moves effectively. The split let more offensive Pokemon unlock hidden potential, essentially. Gen 4 also introduced new items like Choice Scarf, Choice Specs, and Life Orb, as well as one of the most important moves in competitive play, Stealth Rock. Overall, I consider Gen 4 the beginning of modern competitive Pokemon. The only reason I wouldn't say that power creep was purely positive is due to three problematic Pokemon. Machamp, who was banned for RNG-related reasons. Jirachi, whose Iron Head and Thunder Wave combination is also very RNG-reliant and makes the tier sometimes feel like a coin flip. Latias, who may argue is so strong that Jirachi is needed to keep her in check, are kind of three Pokemon that made Gen 4 slightly worse than Generation 3. While Machamp was recently banned, we can't ignore the fact that it was there for like plus 10 years. Outside of that, the power creep was quite healthy, improving upon Generation 3 and maintaining a balanced shift from OU to UU. Generation 2. Gen 2 is much more nuanced than the previous generation. It's often not as talked about in a super positive light, but it brought a lot of important foundational mechanics. While the power creep from Gen 3 and Gen 4 was mostly positive additions that helped balance the game, Gen 2 is known for being the most centralized metagame, with Snorlax appearing on nearly every single team. That's why it has a 50% win rate, because it's on every single team. Still, the most mechanical changes in Gen 2 introduced were good for the game long term, if we look at the big picture style. Item slots were introduced, and although most Pokemon just ran leftovers, which contributed to how bulky they became, it was a step forward in customization and diversity. And while you could still max out stats, resulting in bulkiness, there wasn't anything Gen 2 introduced that was inherently broken. And what I mean by that is, let's take a look at the most powerful Pokemon in Gen 2. The strongest Pokemon were mostly Gen 1 Pokemon, like Snorlax and Zapdos that were featured on literally every single team. No Gen 2 Pokemon was particularly a problem. These were Pokemon from the previous generation. Gen 2 also introduced spikes, something that might not have seemed like a positive thing at the time because it's kind of annoying, but in fact, hazards in general are not always fun, but they are necessary way to make progress against most teams, but especially to stall. Spikes became one of the main ways to apply pressure in Generation 2, and it laid the foundation for the importance of entry hazards in modern play. They literally shift the entire way we play competitive Pokemon, in singles at least. So despite this reputation, I would rank Gen 2 fairly high in terms of healthy power creep. We just need to look at it long term, not in this specific generation. We need to look at how these changes affected Pokemon positively as a whole. None of the Pokemon introduced were overpowered, and the mechanics, though annoying at the time, ended up being positive additions to competitive scene. Now, Gen 6 and 7. I'm ranking Gen 6 and 7 around the same level in terms of how positive the power creep was. Both generations introduced were very strong Pokemon. In Generation 6, mainly the super strong Pokemon were Megas. Mega evolutions like Mega Scizor, Mega Mawile, etc., etc. That defined the entire OU meta. In Gen 7, it was particularly Ultra Beasts, who were very popular and powerful. However, I don't think the Pokemon introduced in either gen were too overpowered. Mega Evolution is generally more like the Dinzy move, yes, but I think that their objective contributions to power creep as a whole are fairly equal. I wouldn't say either of them had a super negative effect on the metagame or power creep. While I would place Gen 7 slightly above Gen 6 though, is in the mechanical aspects they introduced. Gen 7 added terrain effects and nerfed the burn stat, both positive changes. Gen 6 is a bit more complicated though. It introduced the fairy typing, knockoff buff, the steel nerf, defog buff, and removed infinite weather. Removing infinite weather was a huge positive, like objectively so. It ended the weather wars. The fairy type was controversial but necessary. But the knockoff buff, that's where it gets complicated. Because personally, and this could be debated, but it felt kind of unnecessary. Removing a held item is already strong, it didn't need to be buffed as a move. So because of that misstep, I'm placing Gen 7 just slightly above Gen 6. Gen 5. Gen 5 sometimes gets a bad reputation, partly due to its chaotic past. It's true that Generation 5 introduced a hyper-offense weather-dominated metagame. Mechanically, it didn't change as much as Gen 2, 3, or 4. But it did introduce some of the strongest Pokemon to ever enter the competitive scene for OU. Pokemon like Landorus, Thundurus, Keldeo, and Excadrill became staples of hyper-offense and weather teams. Gen 5 is often viewed as a caricature of what power creep looks like when taken too far, and for good reason. The power creep was huge. The Gen 4 and Gen 5 tier were practically unrecognizable. To be fair, the tier is much more stable now after bans, like banning Cloyster or the removal of gems. But historically, Gen 5's power creep overshadowed the mechanical additions it brought to it, and it wasn't necessarily balanced, so I'm ranking it fairly low because of that. Gen 8. I'm ranking Gen 8 very low, even though it's not particularly hated by the community. So why is it so low? One reason, Gigantamax. Gigantamax is considered by competitive players to be a completely broken mechanic and the worst generational gimmick so far. That reduced battles to who Dynamax is better. It overshadowed everything else in the game and was eventually banned, because the game was no longer about predicts or smart plays, it was about purely Dynamax. It didn't make sense. Generation 8 also introduced heavy-duty boots, which are arguably the most controversial item ever. Giving essentially a pseudo-magic card to any Pokemon as an item is a really huge deal, and depending on who you ask, probably not the best idea. It's especially popular on stall teams. While hazards are essential for progress against stall, boost makes that much more complicated. You could still use knockoff, but still, now you have to run Pokemon with that move. More complicated, like I said. Still, I'm not ranking Gen 8 the lowest because most of the Pokemon introduced there weren't excessively overpowered. The only real exception might be Urishifu, but even that affected VGC more than singles. Generation 9. Generation 9 has been the most controversial generation yet, even more than Gen 5 or Gen 8. Especially because of Terra. Unlike Gigantamax, which was quickly banned and generally agreed upon as broken, Terra has been hotly debated. There have been multiple suspect tests and community votes, trying to decide whether it should be banned or not. Although Terra can be fun, I don't think the positive outweighs the negatives. It's unpredictable and often makes strong Pokemon even stronger. For example, Volcarona and Regieleki were already two great Pokemon in their own right, but Terra pushed them over the edge. Terra gave them far more variety, and basically they couldn't be walled. Beyond that, Gen 9 has had more bans and tier shifts than any other generation in history. OU staples have dropped to UU, and the ripple effects across the lower tiers has created a lot of chaos. Game Freak seems to be trying to outdo themselves every single generation, and Gen 9 shows the instability of constantly pushing the power ceiling. Those are my thoughts on power creep in each gen. Feel free to disagree or tell me something that I missed. Thank you.